And the shift, I think, from maybe the 1960s or so, where computers were designed for specific applications. I mean, the very first applications of computers were tracking surface-to-air missiles and trying to calculate how they could hit a moving airplane, to document-based computing, which is the way that most people still think about computing. So you have a Word document or an image file or something like that you want to edit, to what is becoming more and more common, relationship-based computing. So most of the CPU cycles burned in most of the planet are just enabling people's communication with each other. I mean, that's true just on the basis of the CPUs and cell phones doing the GSM and CDMA crazy math so that we can talk to each other on the phone. But more and more true with online services and people's use of their desktop computers. So now, I gotta keep it tight. One more crazy tangent. So the 5K contest that I started had one really interesting kernel in it that has guided me through all kinds of things. And that's the idea of dealing with constraints. So 5K, for anyone who's made a web page, sounds ridiculously small. It even sounded ridiculously small in 99, 2000. It's a very small JPEG thumbnail, about 1 second of MP3, 850 words of English as stored in ASCII format. And it's actually, in an information theoretic point of view, an incredibly large amount of information, because each bit in that 5,120 bytes is a 1 or a 0 and one little discrete bit of possibility space. And in 5K of information, there's 2 to the power of 40,960 possible messages. So if you're not so good at math, it's a number that you can't even comprehend how large it is. It's actually more than the number of milliseconds since the Big Bang multiplied by the number of particles in the universe. So how come something so big seems so small? It's because there's a series of constraints that we apply to it. So in the case of web design, we have some basic constraints of encoding, so information that will actually make sense to a computer if you're going to render it as a web page. So ASCII or Unicode encoding for the text, and the constraints of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, each of those kind of layer on and reduce the number of possibilities. And of course, on top of that, we have the constraints of what makes sense to someone, the rules of grammar, the conventions of idiom, basically the constraints of most of those 2 to the power of 40,960 messages are gibberish, and we wouldn't understand them. And then there's aesthetic constraints, because this is a web design competition. People are just trying to design something that's good or beautiful or interesting or something like that. And as you layer each of those on, you get a much smaller space of possibilities. And my background's in design, and this is probably the most influential thing I've ever heard anyone say about design, that design is the successive application of constraints until only a unique product is left. And no matter how you think about creative activity, you can identify those constraints right up. Most people here probably had some music lessons at some point, and we understand the basic constraints in music. There's meter, the waltz and 3/4, time signature, the key that a song is in, more advanced constraints like modality and the type of music, and then obviously constraints about what sounds good. And people have introduced constraints into their creative activity as a way of focusing the creativity for a very long time. So the 5K was actually, I didn't really know this at the time, but I found out shortly after, part of a whole history of design competitions that were based on extreme constraints. And in fact, it goes back to the beginnings of any kind of creative activity. Oh man, I can't remember what it's called now. There's a Greek name for a form of writing which excludes certain letters from your writing. And this is a Canadian author, Christian Book, who wrote a novel called Eunoia, which is each chapter only uses one vowel. So E is obviously the easiest one, and this is a selection from the E chapter in his book. So no U's, I's, O's, or A's in this chapter, and conversely through all of them. People have been doing this form of poetry since, as far as we know, about 400 BC. And if you look at the history of 20th century creativity, you can see people playing with constraints in a pretty radical way, from getting rid of representationalism in visual arts to getting rid of a lot of the constraints of key and time signature in jazz, and the crazy architecture that people do in architecture school now, which doesn't even result in a building that you could build even without regard for cost. And it's interesting because play is, going back to Ludocorp, one of the most interesting things in the world. And it's really exaltation of the possible, it's celebration of the possible, often a refiguring of what is generally understood to be possible. So, this is all going to make sense in a second. Real creativity, I think, and the good kinds of innovation result from people who have a mastery over what's possible. And mastering what's possible comes from a deep understanding of the constraints that you face. So when I used to hire people to be web designers, I actually had a lot more stock in people who tooled around on the web and had the web as a hobby than people who had traditional graphic design backgrounds. Just like I probably wouldn't hire a web designer to be a print designer, because if you came from a print background, you might have an excellent understanding of the way different kinds of inks and papers work. With web design, you had an excellent idea of what was possible in HTML, what was possible across a range of browsers. And it's the same thing in business, I think. And this is the message I would have for entrepreneurs, that engaging in commerce is fundamentally a creative act. And you can not think of it that way and get by just fine. But I think if the result you desire is something that is, in a fundamental sense, innovative, if you don't really understand all the constraints that are at work, if you don't have a deep understanding, then you can't really change what is possible. And I think you can stumble into that, because we didn't start Flickr with the idea that there's something wrong with today's photo sharing web services and we're going to fix it. But as we dived into that space, we did look at Ophoto, Shutterfly, Snapfish, which were really the dominant photo sharing services, and think about what they were doing, which was sharing as a loss leader for printing. The business was about getting people to print, and the only reason they had any sharing facility was it would entice people to look at the photos with the hope that they would pay 23 cents for a 4x6 print delivered in the mail. And I think that the good kind of entrepreneurialism is, whether it's socially conscious business or not, is generally looking at what people do and how you can produce something of value in the totally generic sense. Obviously, money is one way of counting value, but in the generic sense, and have that be something that's self-sustaining. So I'll finish with the same thing I started with, that we routinely overestimate the short-term effects and underestimate the long-term effects. For people working in, I don't really like the term digital media very much, but for people working in digital media, people working in technology, the internet, any of those spaces, the effects are still, in the long term, radically unknown. And the more we understand those constraints, the more we can design great businesses that do all kinds of good things for the world. So I'll leave it there, and I think I have exactly 10 minutes for questions. I'm on time. Ooh. Oh. I should say, if you need to reach me, that's my email address. And the new company is called Tiny Spec.